Hi, so here we are at Stewart Lake County Park, and we're going to do our Into the Forest Watershed Explorers. I'm Robert Bohanan, and I'm the board president of the Upper Sugar River Watershed Association, and I'm also a scientist at UW-Madison. I'm a scientist and an educator, and I work in a place called With Science, and with Upper Sugar River and With Science, I get to work with some people that really care about science, that care about nature, and that care about education. And so we're going to begin exploring this park and see what we can learn about forest, how it's connected to other things, and I hope you have lots of questions. Thanks. So here we are at the edge of Stewart Lake, and one of the things that I love about ecology is I love to try to study all the different connections that we find, and so this is a perfect example. Even though we're here to do a Watershed Explorers on Into the Forest, we're standing by a lake. And so very often forest will be connected to bodies of water. Sometimes it's a little stream, sometimes it's a pond, sometimes it's a wetland, sometimes it's a small lake, sometimes it's a big lake. And so this is a really good example. I'm going to flip the camera around and show you then some of the other features at this park. So here we're still by the lake, and you can see we're at a beach. There's a playground up there, a parking lot, and if we just slowly pan around, then you can see there's a road, lots and lots of different trees, and some of the trees have leaves on them. Some of them are green right now, but many of them do not. Some still even have dead leaves on them. And so one of the things we'll be talking about today is trees and learning how to identify different trees. But this is a great spot to talk about one of the things I love about ecology, and those are the connections that we find. And so here, all the water, all the rainfall, all the snow that falls in this area, it flows downhill, because we're kind of like in a little bowl, and it falls into this lake that we're looking at here. And all this area that surrounds this lake is called a watershed. And so I study watersheds. I don't just study lakes. I don't just study streams. I don't just study forest. I study watersheds because I really like to study the connections. So here, one of the things that I want you to notice with me is all the dead leaves, all the leaves that have fallen from the trees last fall, and they're still here. They've turned brown, and these leaves are an important part of this ecosystem. They provide nutrients for the soil, for other plants to grow. There are fungi and other organisms, insects, that will eat these. And some of these leaves, if they fall into the lake, even become food for fish. Now, the fish don't eat the leaves directly, but they eat a lot of the things that live on the leaves, a lot of the little worm-like creatures that we'll find, like the midges and lake flies and mayflies. So just look at this tree in front of us, and what do you notice? What do you notice about the bark? About maybe the color of the tree? Oh yeah, that's right. This tree has bark that's kind of peeling away, and this is a birch. This is a big white birch, and this is right beside the lake. There are a lot of different birches, and maybe we'll see some others as we explore around. But this is a tree that is pretty common in this area, and it's also a tree that you might see in your neighbor's backyard or even your own backyard. Here's another tree, and this is one of my favorite trees. And the bark's different from the bark that we saw on the birch. It's kind of flaky. It's not peeling away, and it looks a little thicker. What do you notice about this? The bark looks to me like it's like a bunch of potato chips that have been glued onto the tree. And this is a black cherry. And this is another tree that we find a lot in this area. Here's another black cherry. This one's a little bigger and a little older, but again, you can see all the different little bits of bark that just look like little potato chips stuck all over. And then if you look closely, you might notice some other things on this bark. And those are fungi. Different kinds of fungi will very often be living on trees, and that's another example of the kind of connections that we find. So here's another feature that we often see near forest. And this is a little stream, and the stream is flowing along, and you can see it flows into the lake. And then also you'll notice that between the forest and the lake is a big wetland, lots of cattails. And then we see a lot of little shrubs, not quite trees, but shrubs. And they have red stems. And those are red osier dogwoods. And sometimes we need to remove some of those to take care of those. We find those in wetlands a lot. So red osier dogwood. And here's some of those dogwoods up closer, so you can see just the red stems, the red twigs. And here's another example of that white birch that we saw. So you can see the bark is white, and the tree tends to be pretty straight. Very often out in the forest, you'll see them with a single trunk, but often in people's yards and in neighborhoods, there'll be a number of different trunks, kind of like a cluster. Now here's a tree we haven't seen. So what do you notice about the bark on this tree? It's kind of gray, grayish brown. But if you look closely, then there are patterns in the bark that look almost like diamonds. So in several places, the bark tends to grow and they come together as little diamonds. And this is an ash, a green ash. And here's a close-up of the green ash bark, and hopefully you can see a whole bunch of different diamonds, diamond shapes, all connected. This is one of my favorite trees. This is a tree that we had growing on our farm in East Tennessee where I grew up. And this is one of my grandpa's favorite kinds of trees. And what do you notice about the bark on this tree? Yeah, it looks like it's in strips that are pulling away. And this is a shagbark hickory. So this will produce nuts, hickory nuts that you might find. Some people eat them. Squirrels depend on them. So a shagbark hickory. And here's another tree that's a little different. The bark is kind of gray. It's not very thick. And it looks like it's got long vertical stripes going up it. You know, the bark has almost like a striped pattern going up. And this is called a hophornbeam, or sometimes some people call it ironwood. But this is another tree that we find in areas like this park and a lot of different forests in Wisconsin. And here's another example of the hornbeam. I think you can even see the sort of striped pattern on the bark a little more readily than you could the other one. You can also see a lot of different lichens, the little green things growing on the bark. So here's a short shrubby-like plant growing, and you can see a lot of different little trunks sort of growing out of the ground. This is a honeysuckle, and this area there's a lot of honeysuckle. And honeysuckle is an example of a species that can tend to take over areas of forest, especially along the edges, like near trails. And what they do is they kind of choke out other plants. They don't leave much room for other plants to grow, especially plants that like to grow along the edge. And so sometimes this is a plant that needs to be removed so that other plants can thrive. So this tree has a very interesting bark. The bark is raised, and it's raised in layers. And I'm going to get a little closer, and you can see the layers that are built up. And so they tend to be along lines, but layers and layers built up on each other. And this tree is called a hackberry. Sometimes the bark pattern is referred to as stucco, but I think the best way to think about it is just the ridges look like they have layers and layers and layers. So I'm going to give you a little quiz, a little test. Is this a birch, a white birch? Is it a shagbark hickory? Or is it a black cherry? What do you think? It's a black cherry, you're right, because it's got the potato chip-like pattern on the bark. So let's look at this tree. And this is a huge tree. It's very tall. Its branches are spread out. I don't think we've seen a tree like this yet. And this is one of the biggest trees that we've seen. And if you look closer, you can see that part of the bark in patches is kind of white. So notice the different white patches on there as we go up and down the tree. And then if we get closer to the bark, you can see the bark's fairly thick. And so it would be very protective. But when we have trees that tend to have fairly thick bark and are tall and big, that they're very often going to be an oak. And if they have these white patches, then they're usually a white oak. There sometimes might be black or red oaks in here. Those are pretty hard to tell apart. And then also maybe some bur oaks. We'll see if we can find some. There are some more oaks in the distance that you can see, sort of in this little valley between the two sides of the hill. And not too far from here, like if we go down, there's that little stream of the lake again. Oh, let's look at this tree. And it's a young tree, it's very small. I'm taller than this tree. What's it remind you of? Maybe a holiday tree or a Christmas tree you have, or maybe a tree growing in your yard. Let's take a closer look. So this tree has leaves, and the leaves are green. So they're doing photosynthesis. They're using light and carbon dioxide, and they're making sugar for the tree to grow. And then they're releasing oxygen as well. They're using some of the oxygen for themselves too, because living things, they usually need oxygen. But if you look close, this has little short needles. And if you pull the needle off and roll it between your thumb and finger, it has ridges. These needles are kind of square shaped. And this is an example of a spruce tree, a spruce. And this is probably a white spruce. Because white spruce are pretty common in southern Wisconsin, and then we see more black spruce in northern Wisconsin. So here's another plant, another little shrub-like tree that is a problem sometimes because it tends to grow and doesn't allow for other kinds of plants to live. And on this plant, this is called a buckthorn, and it has the tips of the twigs are pointed, almost like a thorn. But we know it's not a thorn because they have buds where leaves will grow out at the base. So do you remember this tree? We've seen it before. Look at the pattern on the bark. Do you see the diamonds? Yes, you're right. That's a green ash. Oh, now do you see that tree up ahead? It's got a lot of green leaves on it, maybe needles like we saw on the spruce. We don't see many of those, do we? We haven't seen many trees with needles, or sometimes they're called conifers because they have cones on them. Sometimes they're called evergreen because they tend to have their leaves green all year round. We'll take a closer look up here. So here's that conifer that we were looking at. You can see the bark's a little different, but also notice the pattern of the branches coming off the trunk. They're almost in a whirl. They go around. They don't zigzag, but they go around, almost making a circle around the tree. And then if you look at the leaves, you can see really long needles compared to the spruce that we looked at. The spruce, the needles were only about a ½ inch long. These are probably about 3 inches long. And so a tree like this, with the whorls around the branch and sort of the grayish black bark, those are usually white pines, and we have a lot of those. And here's another good example of that kind of white patchy pattern on the bark of what kind of tree was it? That's right, white oaks. So here, this area, it looks like it's mostly oak trees. And we're kind of on a little hill, a little ridge. And it's mostly oak trees growing with other oak trees. And it's kind of grassy around it. So we're really kind of on the edge of the forest. And let's take a closer look at the bark on this tree. Notice how thick it is. I mean, the furrows go in almost an inch. And so this has very, very thick bark. And this is called a bur oak. And bur oaks tend to live in grassy areas, almost like a prairie, but usually with a few trees. We call that kind of habitat a savanna. And sometimes they're on the edge of a forest. And these trees are very old, maybe 200 to 300 years old. Can you believe that? 200 to 300 years old. And one of the things that this real thick bark does for the tree is it can protect it from fires. So even though there might be a fire, and there used to be a lot of fires in savanna. In fact, savannas needed fire to keep out a lot of other like weedy trees and weedy plants that would take over and change it from a savanna into a forest. And so this tree can survive, when it's this old and has this thick a bark, it can survive fires very often. Now, as we've been walking around We haven't seen many evergreens or conifers, trees that have cones. We saw a couple of white pines and we saw spruce, but we never really saw more than one together. And here's a whole bunch growing together. So can you think of a reason why, kind of like with the bur oaks, where we saw them in a clump growing together just with other bur oaks? Can you think of a reason why this would be mostly pines here? So here we are in the pines, in that clump of pines, and notice what's different. One, it kind of smells like a Christmas tree, but also look at the ground. It doesn't have a thick layer of leaves, just a very thin layer of needles. And over here is a cone, some cones that we can see. So different cones on the ground. Here's some more cones. And the cones hold the seeds. And so what's different about the ground here? Yeah, not all those leaves. And also in the forest with the oaks and the hickories and the ash and the hornbeams, there were layers and layers and layers of leaves. But with this, there's just a little thin layer. And then underneath is the soil. And also notice all the roots coming right through on the trail. So the roots on pines like these, they don't grow very deep. Like we didn't see roots growing through the ground and with the maples and the birch and the oaks and the ash. But here we see a lot of roots growing right through to the top of the ground, right on the trail. So do you have any ideas why there might be only pines growing here? So one of the things about conifer trees, and especially pines, and with all those needles that then decay, is they make the soil very acidic, and so more like vinegar, and so it would be more like a sour kind of soil, whereas the soil in like where those oaks were would be more basic, would be less acidic, and would be more like baking soda. And so it may be that one of the reasons that only pines grow here is because they change the soil by dropping their needles in the way they grow. They change the soil in a way that only pines can grow. So here we are at the edge of where the pines were, and you can see that what's covering the ground begins to change. Even though there are still a few pines down here, there are mostly leaves instead of needles. And so you can see a covering of leaves, and those will begin to change the soil. And also part of what they do is by changing the soil, it also changes what other plants can grow there and what animals live there. So here's another tree that's got green, needle-like leaves on it, but the needles look different. Let's take a closer look. And so here the needles are almost shaped like a triangle, and they're very short and sharp. So they're only about a 1/4 inch long, and they're kind of flat. And so this is a cedar, a white cedar. Like when we were comparing the ground cover with the pines, where you just had those thin layers of needles, look at this, look how thick this is, all these leaves. And we just go down and down and down, And this is a part of the forest that's really fun to explore. You can take a look and you can start to find all kinds of organisms, especially insects and arthropods. So one of the things that you may have noticed as we were walking around is sometimes there look like trees that have been cut and shrubs that have been cut and bushes. And that's one of the things about forest, is that now humans, people like us that really care a lot about the forest, we have to help the forest take care of itself. And that's one of the ways that you can help. There are a lot of volunteer activities with different groups to sort of help the forest, and this is one of the examples. And so here's another example of how we can help forest. Sometimes trees are planted, and sometimes young trees that we really want to give them a chance to grow have to be protected. And so this is a sleeve that's around very young tree just beginning to grow that will protect it from deer. So here we are where we began, the end of our walk. You might remember the lake down there, and then we walked into the forest. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we saw and learned. So one of the first things that we started talking about when we began our walk was to look for connections. And we've seen connections between the water and the land and the water. We saw connections between different parts of the forest, places where only oaks grew, places where only pines grew, places where they both grew, and then a lot of other different kinds of trees. And so that's one of the things to pay attention as you walk around, is the interconnections, because different parts of the forest, different parts of the watershed depend on each other. The lake depends on leaves falling in for nutrients, and then the forest depends on insects that might be growing as larvae in the lake that then fly out and pollinate or eat other kinds of pesky insects. And not only do insects help the forest, insects that are coming from the lake and growing in the lake and around the lake, but also insects are eaten by many, many, many different species of birds. And we didn't really look at any birds today, but sometime later we'll come back and we'll take a look at the different kinds of birds, because there are many species here. And then one of the questions that we asked was why certain kinds of plants grow in certain areas, why certain areas only have maples or oaks, why others have mostly pines or conifers. And part of that we thought was maybe because of the kind of soil there, but the kind of trees also help create the kind of soil. And there's an invisible part of the forest, or invisible to most people, where in the soil there are vast numbers of different kinds of organisms, fungi and bacteria, all different kinds of insects, different kinds of arachnids, different kinds of arthropods, and those also help create the type of environment that they're in. And then finally, one of the things that we looked at was how humans can help care for a forest. And we saw examples where trees had been planted. We saw examples where different kinds of plants like buckthorn and honeysuckle might begin to take over and crowd out other species. And so sometimes those are removed. Sometimes they even bring in goats to help remove species that take over. And so humans have a really important connection to the forest, both as caretakers, but also as organisms that love the forest, that need the forest to live. Just walking around today, I felt so good about being in the forest, being out in nature, being away from all the noise that I usually hear. Forests are wonderful places, beautiful places, and important places. And so I hope you visit it. I hope you have some questions. I'd like to thank the Dane County Parks Foundation for helping provide some funding for this. I hope you visit Stewart Lake Park. I hope you visit other Dane County parks. I'd also like to thank Upper Sugar River Watershed. It's my colleagues and then the members, and then also my colleagues at University of Wisconsin-Madison at WisScience, because all of them have played a part in helping us make this available to you. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the forest.